Welcome to the Blockbusters and Birdwalks podcast. I am the curator, Garrett Chaffin-Quiray. Today we feature a conversation.
Hi all, this is Tom Long, functioning idiot who's been lucky enough to work in comic books since 1995.
30 Days of Night is a quality movie. It's the right length, it's visually interesting, it's got a good soundtrack. It's in fact a kind of a screenwriting demo for how it is you build a character with a specific set of problems, a psychology that arms them to deal with the issues they face, and it also helps them solve the internal dilemmas they've got as personalities, putting them out the other side with a satisfying conclusion that makes sense.
Oh yeah, man, I dug it as well, and it is one of my favorite horror movies. It is faithful to the source material. As a comic book fan, like I watch it once a year, I think, usually around Halloween time, because it is, and I'm not just a comic book fan, I'm also a fan of horror, like the horror genre, and this is true horror. And a lot of people can't handle it because, it's too real for them and they're sensitive and they empathize too much with the characters, but this does what a horror movie is supposed to do, is make you uncomfortable.
The gist is that we are in the northernmost point of the United States, Barrow, Alaska, which I had not heard of before this movie. So that's fun. You get a chyron on screen, which I'm sure is just pulled text right from one of the caption boxes in the comic, explaining that beginning the first day of winter, there is a continuous 30 days of no daylight, 30 days of night. And at that point, just before sunset, most of this small town of 600 or 700 people, they abscond for the lower 48 or at least mainstream Alaska so they can keep up with their families, their other lives, and whatever. And there's a skeleton crew of 150 or so people who remain behind just to make sure the oil works, which is what this town is based on doing, remains stable. This crew involves hardcore MAGA types, to use a modern term. They're people who really want to be left alone to their own devices to just deal with nature and do what they wish. And so there's that. There's a local sheriff. There are technicians who run up into the plant, basic safety and health measures and so on. And so that's our kickoff. That's what we watch. The people leave town, and in the middle of this, we have a sheriff. That is Eben Olsen. That's Josh Hartnett before I think he took a break from making movies. And man, is he looking like a handsome young cat. He must be 35 or so at the time, and he's got this estranged wife who's basically leaving him as the thing opens. Stella, and that's Melissa George. She misses her flight out of town for weird circumstances, and they're forced then to deal with the fact they're going to be in this 30 Days of Night with a disintegrated marriage. Great fun. In the middle of that, a stranger rolls up and starts cutting power. Why? Who knows? He starts killing animals, the dogs and sled dogs and so on. And eventually they discover that they are the prey for some kind of vampire-like creature, but nobody can believe it until, heads start showing up on spikes and they watch their neighbors slowly get eviscerated. I'm overtelling it. In the end, a small group of people survive the initial attack from the vampires and dig in to hide and quiet so they can outlast these vampires. To make all of that happen, the marriage comes back together again because Eben and Stella remain in love and rediscover one another, but he has to sacrifice himself to take on the vampire leader and therefore buy just enough time so everybody can actually go out and meet sunlight. Interestingly and wonderfully, he lets himself be infected by the vampire virus and walks to the sunrise where he begins to disintegrate with his wife holding him. End movie.
You captured what they got most right, I think, is that in vampire lore, there's all variations of what these vampires. In Twilight, you got the little twinkly, pretty boys, in Lestat, you got these effeminate, androgynous, lovers.
Yeah.
In this movie, I say that based on the way the comic wrote them, vampires are bullet-resistant chimps with rabies. Like, they are feral apex predators. Like in the film, I really liked that they have their own language. They even the leader even shares we've waited centuries to convince them that we didn't exist. Now we can come up here where we can feast and buffet for 30 days. Like, they kept some of the vampire lore rules, which was great. Like UV, burns them and kills them. The use of a familiar for when they, it's daylight and they need suppression. That opening sequence where Eben and his deputy are out there staring at, the sun rising for the last day before the 30 days of night. And then it cuts later to, this random ship out there, and this guy in a parka just standing on these ice floes, like you're like, what the hell is this? And then he is the familiar coming into town to cut them off. He, destroys their satellite phones, and he kills the dogs who might be a threat, because they're vampires, but they're not supernatural. They're animalistic. They can't fly, they can't transmutate, they can't control people's minds, none of that. They're just out to, feast. Like, they don't just drink the blood. It seems like they eat the flesh. Like, they're there to smorgasbord this small town. So that's true horror. That was the beauty of it.
The language thing I'd forgotten about, but it's rich, that it's never subtitled. We just get the garbledy, spooky sound of it. And I know that a few years later, I would connect that in my own mind with World War Z, and how the zombies in that movie have this strange way of communicating. It's proto-linguistic. I mean, they don't seem to be carrying sentences and having big thoughts, but they are kind of like meat over there. Meat over there for me, and that's sort of what's going on. But yeah, these vampires, they're completely stratified into a hierarchy of leader followers. It's completely organized like a military unit. And when they attack, their tactics are good. They hunt. They play with their meat. They string people along, and they know that there is a way to get the stragglers, the survivors rather, of this little group out in the open if they can just test them in just the right way. And Danny Huston plays the leader of that group. Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly when it is that I first noticed him as a performer, but I find him extremely trustworthy as a bad guy. I'm sure he's played warm roles in his time that I would cuddle up to and enjoy, like, Uncle Danny's come to the show. But in general, I see him and remember him as a villain, and he's very good at it. Blood dripping off of his fangs, a certain kind of authority. I'd call him handsome, but under all of that makeup and then behaving the way that he does, he's really a bastard, and I really feel uncomfortable. Like, he must stink. Their vampire hygiene is weird relative to what I would expect, and it's hinted at in the way that production design works. They are repulsive, and they just take over this town and just go havoc over it. These overhead shots where they're looking down on whatever the set was, and you're seeing the sprays of blood as people are being geysered into death. It's terrific fun, like, quote, fun, because as you say, it is at base a horror movie. For a few minutes, just I was tickled by the idea of I would sit down with my 12-year-old and watch it with her, and I thought, no, she's not ready for this.
Yeah, it is the stuff of nightmares. I got to watch the premiere down in San Diego because of my freelance work for IDW Publishing at the time. So it was their comic that was licensed for the Sam Raimi film. And then that Comic-Con was shortly thereafter, and I was at the IDW party, and the director was there. And he was talking to some people, and I didn't get a chance to speak with him, but some of the people who did were coming over and telling me about, his intentions for the film. And I remember one person, it struck me, and she said, he said he directed this film to punish the audience for watching it. Mission accomplished, man, because that you talked about their tactics. Like, that was truly horrific when, as they're cleaning out this town of food, they're trying to find all the people in hiding. So what do? They take a young girl and they use her as bait, and they force her to walk down the middle of town screaming for help. And when help doesn't come, they start, physically assaulting her, like cutting her up, scratching her with their claws to elicit pain and get her to call even stronger for people. It's horrible, but that is exactly how you manipulate humans. And if we see somebody hurt, we go running to that person. That even if you don't like the person, you're going to help them. Even if you don't know them, like, that's just in our nature to be helpers. So for these creatures to use that tactic, and then for that director to make that choice to put that scene in there, was like, it was true horror.
That's a fun remark. David Slade is the director, so I'm glad he owned up to that intention, because you're right, it does come through. That scene of the woman being put down the street to become the lure is extraordinary, because we cross-cut between our primary group of survivors. We realize there are several groups of survivors, but we're mostly spending our time with the sheriff, Eben, and his crew of 5 or 6 people. And we watch their suffering because they feel pulled to go do something about this. And he shuts all that down. We cannot defeat this group of monsters who are numerically superior to us, who understand what they're doing far better than we do, and we can't take losses. Also, she's basically already gone. They can rip her to shreds in an instant's notice. We must swallow our humanity and in our own way become like a secondary monster by recognizing personality, ourselves first, is all that we can worry about. There's another scene later when a literal little girl is discovered in a grocery store run. They're trying to get supplies and move to find a superior advantage as they go through town, because they say to themselves, we know this town, we know about winter, we can simply move around them if we're careful and find advantage to our hiding places. So in one of these moves, they go into a grocery store and there's this little girl feasting on an adult just having opened up the neck. It's so gnarly, because another sort of tendency in our society is to idolize the young as innocent and naive and worth our protection, and to reverse that and make a child this predatory, awful beast that must be destroyed. And then the sheriff's younger brother, who's himself a teenager, just barely still inside of childhood, is the one who dispatches her. And we watch that young performer register his anguish over having done this monstrous, terrible thing.
The scene that gets me is, as you said, they're all hiding out. So, several days have gone by. The vampires are trying to find out, and they're trying to get supplies. And then they realize that, there's other survivors in other places. And Eben sees the flashlight, and he goes, and it's his deputy's house. And they go in to get him. And then what do they discover? He's killed his daughters and his wife because he didn't want them to suffer under the attack of the vampire. And there's this whole emotional journey they all go through of realizing what he's done. He said he tried to kill himself and the bullet jammed. That is like such an emotionally powerful scene, because you're right. What if you're faced with Armageddon? Would you want to spare your loved ones from suffering, or would you fight like hell right to your last breath to keep everyone alive and keep going like Eben's crew does? So it was this really crazy juxtaposition between these two different leader people, the deputy and the sheriff are both technically leaders in the community, and how they approach the situation.
I've thought about that too, and I'd forgotten. Maybe it's because I put up a blinder in my memory of this movie, because it's a painful thing to regard. And then when you get to it, here it comes, this is dreadful. And the camera kind of peeks into the bedroom, and you can see the shapes of something that's body-like under the covers, and we watch Eben go over and pull. It's dreadful. And we watch as his deputy just goes to pieces. And he's otherwise been a stand-up guy that we've enjoyed his company when we met him early in the movie. This is a person we want as a pillar of the community. And this pillar of the community also did something that I agree with. Taking the lives of your children so they don't become the meat of some monster? Well, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but could I kill my own? I don't know. And so I really feel like that ethical and moral dilemma just collapses on you. As a parent, you think about what that might mean. As a married person, you think about what that might mean. And that actor has a fine job. There was a moment as I watched his registration of having killed his family fall on the face of his friend, the sheriff. And we know the sheriff is pained. You almost feel the sheriff's going to pull his weapon and shoot him. And you also feel like, I understand, and the bear hug and blah. You sort of feel all these dimensions. The first time I remember encountering that in fiction was in the movie translation of the book Beloved, in which Oprah Winfrey and Tandy Newton star as these former enslaved women who have this backstory about having killed their family to avoid being subject to the depredations of what slavery meant. And it's quite devastating when that happened. Now, I was a little late to the game of realizing that parents are put in all kinds of quandaries. And I point to Beloved because it's before I became a parent and was worried about those kinds of problems. Those echoed, though, in the way that it is we struggle to figure out what's the right thing to do for our kids. They fall down and get a boo-boo, you disinfect the injury, you give them a kiss on the head, you send them back into the fray of childhood. But sometimes circumstances can be so desperate and awful. What is your responsibility? And we see that negotiated in the story's arc, and it's perfectly sensible. He's faced with the choice, and he makes one.
And then you talked about his redemption, so he actually ends up becoming a vampire, and that's how they have to dispatch him in order for Eben to use that blood. That was another part that they kept from Vampire What I Like, is that vampirism is an infection, and that if you get bit and survive, you're going to become them. That's where the little girl comes from, because the group even asked, does anybody recognize her? Which I thought was a little bit silly, because she's clearly not dressed like one of the vampires. She wasn't all gross. She's got a cute little dress on and pigtails. But this is a small town, with 500 people. Everybody knew everybody. That was a big point of their spirit of community they had there. So I thought that struck me as off, in that they would know who's got the little kids around town because everybody probably babysits everybody else's kid.
Yeah.
Or, it's probably a one schoolhouse with 30 kids at any given time. So that was a little weird, unless they were trying to say she was one of the vampires who came in on the ship,
And we
which,
didn't see her earlier to know that was the case.
right,
It's a small flaw in how they could have rewritten the scene and just dubbed something with ADR later on to stitch it together, and we would have accepted that. I agree. I stumbled over that. The horror of the confrontation is remarkable, and then their discussion of what they just survived unwinds some of the emotional pressure
yeah,
because
it took it out. It took me out of the storytelling in that. But I'm taking that journey to get back to kind of the problem of a lot of cinema is whatever the lead character is, the like the super Indian syndrome or the Tom Cruise syndrome, where it's like he's the ultimate, the last samurai, he's the or last of the Mohicans, he's a super Indian. Daniel Day-Lewis, like they can do everything better. So when Eben has to turn himself into a vampire in order to have the physical strength to try and save Stella, he's confronted by like a dozen vampires, and of course they had to create some silly vampire etiquette that, oh, he's challenging the leader, so he only has to fight the leader. Yes, they show that the leader is the leader because, people follow his directions, and when they try and act on their own, they always look back for his approval.
right.
That's okay. You'll have an apex leader in any group. But the whole point of being the leader is that you have minions who do your fighting for you. That didn't make sense to me. And then for him to take on, after only recently converting to a vampire within, just a few hours, to suddenly have all the strength he needed to take on a guy who's allegedly been walking the planet for centuries and knows how to do whatever he needs to do. I thought that was a little sick because it was that whole like, oh, I'm going to defeat you with the power of love kind of story.
That does read a little false when you get there. Another small detail, that issue of, the fast-moving monster. And here I would just point to something like 28 Days Later, which to me introduced the fast zombie. It was such a trip to watch these, and they're really chasing after you at full sprint speed. It's quite crazy. That's applied here, and in some scenes, the vampires, while they're not flying and having superhuman sorts of powers, the way that we would in that other kind of comic book movie, they are leaping across rooftops and jumping from high points and landing on their feet and not breaking bones and things. So there is a subtle physics at work, which is ill-defined, because in that final fight scene, we have 35-ish Josh Hartnett and 55-ish Danny Huston duking it out, and it does appear that Danny Huston is a touch slower, right? So the choreography becomes something of a middle-aged dude takes on the young guy, and it's a slower moving thing, more like how it would actually be if you and I were having a beer and somebody started to pick a fight with us. What would we do about it? We try to use basketball moves to get out of the way. Those little things, they're forgivable to me because it does ultimately satisfy and that we realize the vampires need to be defeated. We also are unsure because of the way it is true that Eben defeats the leader. He kills Danny Huston's vampire, and then they sort of scatter. The vampires sort of scatter. We don't watch every last one of them get hunted down or get bleached by the sun and get killed the way that Eben is killed, which I presume is the way the comic book also ends to open up the possibility for a new run. And the movie certainly suggests there could be more. And to that degree, I thought, well, it'd be cool to have another 30 Days of Night. I'd like to see it all happen again.
There is a sequel. It's 30 Days of Night, Dark Days. So there is a comic book sequel, and it is also was made like a direct-to-video movie. So it's out there if you want to go check it out.
Have you read that book?
Yeah. Well, it's been a while. I did read it, but I don't remember much of it. There's actually been many comics since. There is actually a Return to Barrow. There was Tales of 30 Days of Night, I believe. There were many comics after that.
Okay. Well, I'm glad for that success because I think it's a worthwhile franchise, and I can see how this could groom and grow. About the same time that I watched this the first time, I think it's about the same time, I feel like this correlates to my thinking with first being presented a bound copy of The Walking Dead's first compendium. And so I read that, which is when I was starting to become a more mature comic book reader in my deep adulthood, and thinking, this is kind of rad, because panel by panel you watch characters kind of go through a little problem, and there's only so many of those that can be drawn for one adventure, and it takes a certain length of time to read it, but you can come away very satisfied and chewing on that. A movie then just takes the best of one of those adventures and turns it into 90 minutes, which is what we have here in 30 Days of Night. But if it's done well, there's so much possible other stuff that could go on. So I'm pleased to learn that there is more to 30 Days of Night in print And did you see the direct-to-video movie as well, or did you skip that?
I haven't, but I started watching it once, and it was a little slow. A different director, obviously, and so I never finished it. I keep meaning to go back to it, but then I was like, oh, 30 Days of Night is so good. I just rewatched that.
What pleases me about this, perhaps above all things, is it does call back to other horror movies that are fantasy and sci-fi related. The Thing is clearly all over this. The fingerprints are baked right into it. This is not a terribly expensive movie by the scale of what Hollywood uses to make movies. My research showed me it cost around $30 million. The trouble is, it didn't find a mass audience, so it probably recouped its investment internationally. It required that release to the globe in order to probably make back the initial investment, which is too bad. This movie, in other words, wasn't fantastically expensive to create. It was, I think, well done. I don't recall its marketing campaign when it was released to time into the Halloween season of 2007, which is just right. You know, right now we're experiencing the Terrifier sequel and the Smile sequel, which are connecting young people to theaters to go be scared for Halloween. This was an attempt to do that those years ago, and this would have done the job for me had I seen it in the theater at that time. It would have left me with a bad taste in a good way. And sometimes, of course, that's exactly the flavor you're going for. My point, it's too bad this didn't find a market to then spawn sequels or copycats or whatever it might be, because this is good work.
I agree. I think this film is really well made, but as you point out, it didn't find the audience. And that's because, like many genres and many types of films, there is a small target audience for them. So I liken this movie kind of to Near Dark. They're both really well done, and they've got a cult following, but you're not going to find a mass market audience for that.
One other little note that's occurring to me is there's a secondary role played by Marc Boone Jr. He plays this woolly guy who lives on the margins of the society named Beau. And we meet him spilling oil out of his truck all over the snow, despoiling the nature of Barrow and its ecological concerns. I mean, he's a certain kind of a guy. Well, he's a rednecky, sort of white nationalist bad guy is often how he gets coded. And here, our sheriff characterizes him rather winningly from the cab of his truck. I'm giving him a citation, a ticket, for spilling oil on the snow. Not because I expect him to pay it, but he has to know that he's part of this community. He matters to us, even if he lives way out there on his own in isolation. He needs to know that he's got a thread of connection. Back to that point about it being a really well-executed movie, that proves instrumental because he does come swinging back into the arc of the story with his truck and rad equipment attached to it, the same one that was spilling oil earlier, which is helpful in knocking out a bunch of vampires in one swipe and saving the sheriff and his buddies. So that tenuous idea of connection to people, even if you want to be mostly left alone, does matter, I think, to people in our everyday lives post-COVID. It's really important to know that your neighbors recognize who you are.
Yeah, that was great casting from that character from the comic. He starts off as this Grizzly Adams living in a state of nature, leave me alone, kind of off the grid guy. But ultimately, when someone's in trouble, he came running. Like, he's like, well, he even says, it's my turn. Like, okay, I'm stepping up now because people are in trouble and somebody's got to do something.
And I'm glad to hear that's from the comic book, so it's a really well-designed thing. So just a shout then to Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith, who came up with this idea and hatched it. Another analogy that I couldn't help but think about, especially when the sheriff and his half dozen or so survivors find a hole to hide themselves. It's in the attic of a neighbor's home that has a hidden entrance. It's the Anne Frank story. And in that instance, the vampires are playing the role of, the SS and the Gestapo coming in from the Germans exterminating the Jewry of Europe. In its own little kind of symbolic way, that's sort of what we're watching here.
When you watch this, you can pull from all these other stories that we've seen and how it was all brought together in this unique way to tell a brand new version of the vampire myth.
This is Blockbusters and Birdwalks, a conversation between Garrett Chaffin-Quiray and
Tom Long.
Boop boobity doo.